All right, so now we're going to focus on the sister type of the SETI, which is the TISE. So notice that in the previous set of videos, we took a look at what happens if first we started with say TE-SI, and then we said, what if we switch the priorities around to SI above TE, vultologically speaking, I mean, would it also psychologically match, right? And we saw that, yes, it did. So that's great. We tried that once more, going from NIFE to FE&I by inverting the Vultology and seeing if there's an inverted psychology as well. And yes, that also worked. Now we're going to see if the SETI is inverted to a TISE in priority of the Vultology, if there's any sort of corresponding match. So here we go. So the first sample here is James Jean. I'm going to go through the video first once to take a look at the Vultology, and then after we're going to talk about the psychology.
I think my emotional...
Okay, first thing right off, what we see is the disengaging eyes downward, what seems to be a rigid posture, and the arms appear to be retreated near the body. So this is a very characteristic JI expression, but let's see if this continues.
State.
There's a bit of restlessness in the leg. Did you see that? See the leg here? That's kind of what we said in the SETIs. There's some bodily awareness. That's what we call a signal. So that shows up there.
Separate from...
Okay, the hands have this meticulous quality to them. He gesticulated a little, but it was faint. It wasn't very strong. Let's see that again.
Separate from...
Yeah, that wasn't very strong. It also wasn't very casual, though. It was kind of just... It was angular in the J sense as a J lead, but then it kind of retreated in a poised way back to the center. The center line here seems to be the core of his Vultology.
The diligence I put into making
Once again, go out and fold, and disengaging eyes are not stopping the whole time.
my work, because to be...
Okay, now we get a close-up of the face. So we see some tautness around the eyes here, with the orbital area being sharp, and the upper eyelid appears to be lowered above a good portion of the iris, which gives them that sleepy hypnotic look, which is associated with NI specifically, but NISE more generally. Now, some of the tautness seems to be coming from anatomies and ethnicity, but even when accounting for that, this level of sharpness is of the sort that we see in SE users, even in his baseline. Let's continue.
To be human.
There's some eye toggling going on, but they're subtle left and right toggles. Notice there, it's like he's disengaging down with his JI signal, and then he's kind of going left and right with his saccades, which very much speaks to JI lead with SE underneath it. You know, so that seems to be what we're seeing.
So, you know, your body's just sort of this mechanical vehicle for your emotions.
And now he's looking forward again. When they look forward, you can kind of tell the level of hypnotic eyelids that is actually happening. For example, here.
On a daily basis, it kind of defeats any kind of...
Okay, so this gives us a JI lead with SE, but as far as his judgment functions, we can take a look at his emotional energy. So here, for example, when we begin the video, we notice that he has a neutralized emotional expression. And even when we zoom into the face, he's faint in his voice. Notice his voice is a bit like this, where he's not putting much effort into the voice. So, and there's a calmness to him. There's not a lot radiating out to you. He's not affective. He's just kind of stoic, as we see here.
From...
See that? And then the pause to think. Nothing is going on when he's pausing to think. There's no affect.
The diligence I put into making my work.
So going back over here. Again, the and then when there's a it just kind of falls, and it just kind of flatlines. Okay, so now we're going to rewind, and we're going to focus on his psychology for a bit. Here we go.
I think my emotional state is separate from the diligence I put into making my work.
He says, I think my emotional state is separate from the diligence that I put in my work.
The diligence I put into making my work, because to be human.
Here where he says to be human, that's actually the end of a sentence, which I cut off because he's not on camera, unfortunately, and this is what the full sentence looks like. He says, there's something kind of mechanical and unemotional about the process, but you still can't help but to be human.
So, your body's just sort of this mechanical vehicle for your emotions.
So your body is kind of this mechanical vehicle for your emotions. Let's start writing some of this down. So he says that he sees his emotions as separate from his artistic craft, yet he still can't help but to be human. One of the things that I mentioned about the withholding types is that they are impersonal types, right? Now, one thing I need to mention is that all humans, they are persons, and there is a personal awareness that they have. It doesn't mean so it doesn't mean that he, if you were to ask him, are you an emotional person? He may be an emotional person, but there's still a cerebral division where he can analyze himself, however emotional or unemotional he is. And then there's a side of him that is kind of beside the emotion, so to speak. So that's what he is describing anyway. So nobody is impersonal about themselves, but TI has this curious juxtaposition where it is at the same time within a person, the TI user is a person, and yet they are impersonal in internal evaluation, which means what ends up happening is that there is a impersonal evaluation of personness, specifically their own. And so there's a removed an analysis of oneself as if from a third person perspective, even though you're actually internally yourself. That's different than what we see with FI, where FI is just kind of themselves. And even if they talk about themselves, it's more in first person rather than talking about themselves in third person. So I'm going to put here third person analysis of oneself. Okay. And the last part he said,
so your body's just sort of this mechanical vehicle for your emotions.
Body equals mechanical vehicle for emotions. Okay.
And I keep trying to keep that vehicle operating on a daily basis. It kind of defeats any kind of emotionally debilitating feelings that can happen.
Prevents emotional disability from taking over. I'm noticing also with him and the TESI that we saw before, Tucker Carlson, he also had this thing about not wanting emotional control over him. As we saw here, not giving emotional control of yourself to others. But in his case, it's about not having your others have emotional control over you. In the case of James Jean, it's more about not having one's own emotions having emotional control over one's self. It's something like that, which is a very interesting concept.
My design philosophy is, I think, a concentration on aesthetics, on virtuosity.
So design philosophy is focused on aesthetics and virtuosity. Okay.
If I had a time machine and went back into my early days as an artist, I think I would try and actually I probably wouldn't do anything too differently. It all seems to have worked out, through all the disappointments and the rejection and the lessons learned along the way. I think the important lesson I learned was that early on was that I should always make the work that I'm interested in rather than trying to fulfill the expectations of someone else.
I should always do the work that I'm interested in rather than trying to fulfill the expectations of someone else. Here we're getting into that individuality. So do work I'm interested in, not fulfill others' expectations. I'm going to write here also individualism is part of that. Perfect. Okay, I think we got enough of this guy. That's a lot of motifs here and very interesting ones. And of course, I need to add to this artist, painter. Now let's look at the next sample. This is Virgil. He's a professional football soccer player. So we'll take a look at his Vultology first.
I was 18 when I was playing for Willem II.
The eyes disengaging down, partially disengaging down. The upper eyelid hooded. Remember, the hypnotic. Neutralization of the cheeks. So far we're seeing the same thematic correlation.
In Holland, and they didn't offer me a contract at the time. Everything started to click and start feeling that could really be something special. 100%. I think the first couple of...
There's a bit of eye toggling there, but it's kind of subtly going left and right mostly.
Games in Scotland were...
And there's a kind of a zoning out.
Was different. It was a perfect...
He's back down here again.
You know...
Notice his body remains rigid. He's almost unmoving in his Vultology and just kind of just looking down.
Playing for Liverpool.
Notice his kind of faint body posture. Also, he has this gravity to him, but he also has this faint voice. The voice is kind of barely trying.
Obviously, there's a lot of pressure, but you know, without pressure, there's not really something to play for, I think. And
without pressure, there's nothing to play for.
I'm enjoying every bit of it. Yeah, no, obviously, when I'm on the pitch, I'm definitely someone that gives everything for the win.
So he says, I give everything for the win. Now, notice it's interesting that he's saying this, even though he himself appears very remote and removed. It's kind of a little odd, almost paradoxical to see somebody who appears so like faint and is saying in this faint voice, I'm going to give my 100% for the win. There's an apparent mismatch there, but that's actually, there's no mismatch at all. TISEs very much give 100% towards what they do, but it's because of that priority. There's this kind of aspiration for perfect performance or perfect execution that they hold themselves towards. First, there's a JI perfectionism, and then that is applied to whatever medium they happen to be involved in, which is variable. Whatever it happens to be in, it tries to do its best in that domain. So it's like domain-specific kinesthetic specialization. That's one way you can think of the TISE. So we're going to move on now to the next sample. This is Lewis Hamilton. He is a British race car driver.
Started, I think, after we spoke. I think testing obviously was it was solid in terms of the running we had, but I think Ferrari did some serious pace, which we thought at the time we couldn't match. And
in the neutralization, again, like him, these moments where there's a pause and a complete retreat of emotional affect.
That car seemed...
And the disengaging eyes down.
To like just everywhere they put it, every track they put it on, it just...
More of a rigid posture.
Seemed to work without too much work. So I looked upon the year and I just looked at the different things, places where I could have improved.
Hand gestures that are kind of just making subtle gesticulations, but they're not really reaching outward and they're not really impacting very strongly.
Try and work on them, which I did. And
here you can see the tautness of the eyes and the upper eyelid partially hooding.
Yeah, I think I improved on all the areas that I planned to.
The smile here, you can see the more zygomatic focus of it.
So that was kind of really to flesh out any of the concerns on both sides, just be blunt and open. I just saw...
Notice the voice is also very faint. It kind of is not very affected, but it's very just loose like this, very flat. It's a similar flatness to his voice here.
I think it's something good for people that...
Here and here.
As an opportunity to grow.
These two are very similar to each other. They're almost identical in their Vultology. So we're seeing a similarity here. These two men, this guy is a race car driver, which is a very adrenaline-filled, risky activity. And this guy is a football soccer player. Both of them, though, look like very withdrawn, introverted people, very remote, removed people. How is it that they're in the domains that they are? Well, again, that comes down to the fact that it's TI, but the SE is down below. So we see, yet again, a connection to the SETIs, except the SETIs are much more explicit and they're much more gung-ho about these sort of things. They much more live and breathe it. These guys more like evaluate and analyze, and then they kind of do, but do within the realm of the analysis and the refinement. And here the wiki says that in Formula One, Hamilton has won a joint record 7 World Drivers' Championship titles and holds the record for the most wins, pole positions, and podium finishes. And he serves as a master of the Gran Turismo series in Gran Turismo Sport. All right, perfect. There we go. All right, I think we got the handle of this bubble here. This bubble is kind of an athletic bubble, just like we saw with the SCTIs, with a bit of artistry also in there. But let's move on now to something different. This is Jared Leto, which of course you guys know as an actor.
I fell in love the first time that I read the script. It was a character that I had to play.
Notice that very long disengagement, the long flat line where he just says nothing here.
Character that...
There. That's a neutralization.
I had to play.
And then he goes out into animation again.
One of a kind, unique, original, someone who...
Disengaging eyes again, rigid posture.
Was full of life and dreams, someone who...
Disengaging again.
Who was passionate and...
Okay, so basically we can see the Vultology, the TI Vultology. So now let's listen to what he has to say.
Pathetic and had a great heart. Ron Woodruff is...
He's describing different characters that he's played.
In some ways an anti-hero. He's the guy you fall in love with that you don't really think you're going to at first. And I think he's representative of a lot of people. Changes and becomes a better man and becomes really a hero. You know, someone that you fall in love with. I lost a ton of weight, and that was really important. I think it helped provide a fragility to the character. I think that it helped...
So, okay, he's talking about the role in which he lost a bunch of weight, which is this character here. Now, here also on this side is another character he played where he gained a bunch of weight just for the role. And then also here, in another role in which he got completely ripped for a role, even though he says in a kind of normal way, like, I just did it for the role. This is an unordinary level of devotion to the craft. And so I'm going to add that here for Jared Leto as well. Dramatic body transformations. Another thing you might know is that he played a trans character, and he's a method actor, and he stayed in character for the entire duration that he was doing the film. So I'm going to add method acting here as well, long term. That's one of the things about Jared Leto and why he's such an ace in his craft, is because he goes 110%. So here we have a similarity between Virgil and Without Pressure, there's nothing to play for, and I give everything for the win, and the way Jared Leto treats his craft. It's not entirely said the same way. Again, we have to think broader than specifics and just think about what it is that's actually happening here. You have a similar level of devotion to the craft that they're each respectively in. In a way, it's an all-consuming devotion, but also a very cerebral refinement of what they do to the point where they reach high levels of mastery. And that's how you can see the underlying reality that connects these individuals together. Okay, so now here we have a 4-way split screen, and you can see they all have a similar tendency to disengage their eyes downward, to retreat from the object. They come out a little bit with some subtle pushes of gesticulations, but they're faint, and their voice is also subtle. Their voice is not very strong. Okay, that completes our view of the men. Now let's look at the female TISEs that we have, beginning with Lee Ji-yoon. This interview is not in English, but there's subtitles, which is what we're going to use. So first, some Vultology.
굉장히 자주 들을 수가 있었습니다.
감사합니다.
That head nod, very polite head nod, it has a very adaptive FE gesture to it.
좋은 해였던 것 같아요.
그런가요?
네, 제가 직접 프로듀싱한 앨범으로 많이
Exerted pushes.
사랑을 받아서
예.
Disengaging eyes.
그
Also rigid posture, kind of stiff.
개인적으로는 되게 만족도가 높은. 꼭 음도 만지고요.
The smile, zygomatic smile. Also, she's very polite. She's very on beat. She has a coordination to her body, which is measurement, remember. So even though she is more emotional than the men, the emotion is not radiating spontaneously. It's radiating in the opposite of spontaneous. It's very timed. It's the kind of polite, cordial emotion rather than radiative emotion that we see with FI users.
예.
뭐 주제라든지 어떤 이야기를 하고 싶은지, 어떤 그림을 담고 싶은지,
예.
이미지 같은 것도 정하고 구체적으로
And notice she has a symmetrical lip movements.
방향성도
예.
정하고.
그러면 자신이 프로듀싱한 앨범에서
A taut area around the eye, the sharpness of SE.
예.
저는 20대이기도 하고, 뭐 여성이기도 하고,
예.
연예인이기도 하고.
Okay, so now let's take a look at what she's saying through the subtitles.
작년이 조금 더 저에게는 좋은 해였던 것 같아요.
그런가요?
네, 제가 직접 프로듀싱한 앨범으로 많이 사랑을 받아서.
예.
So she produced an album by herself. So she's a singer-songwriter and she produced an album all by herself. This echoes what we saw of James Jean when he says, do work I'm interested in, not fulfill others' expectations, and the individualism of that. So the idea here is that these TiSe types, they'd rather work alone than as part of a team in general. Okay, so let's continue.
개인적으로는 되게 만족도가
So fulfilling year for me personally.
꼭 음도 만지고요.
예.
뭐 주제라든지 어떤 이야기를 하고 싶은지, 어떤 그림을 담고 싶은지,
예.
이미지가 또
She says, I decide the image and make specific decisions on my promotions.
방향성도
So she decides the image and makes X decisions.
하고.
그러면 자신이 프로듀싱한 앨범에서 예.
저는
What's the theme?
20대이기도 하고, 뭐 여성이기도 하고.
We belong to various categories in terms of our identity.
여성이기도 하고,
예.
연예인.
She is 20s and female and a celebrity.
초점을
So rather than focus on just one of
맞추는 게
these,
아니고 그냥 사람으로서
예.
내가 직업인으로서가 아니고 뭐 성별로서가 아니고 그냥 사람으로서 생각하고 겪는 것들에 대해서
예.
담으려고 하고 있어요.
so she, rather than just needing to focus on one of them, she'd focus on all of them. So, but the album is about identity. There's an identity focus, being all the things that are part of identity, not just one. Okay, I'll stop there. Wikipedia says that Lee Ji-young, also known professionally as IU, is a Korean singer-songwriter and actress. It's that actress there. The name IU is a combination of I and you, meaning you and I become one through music. Coming one through music. Perfect. Okay, let's go to the next sample. Here we have Taylor Swift.
Released my album Fearless because on one hand, there are people who are just discovering my music right now, but then on the other hand, there are people who have had this album for a year now. So,
So disengaging eyes, rigid posture,
I have this, I feel like it's
the sharp eyes, the taut area around here.
more in the category of Fearless rather than my next album.
Notice the retreating of her hands.
I put it in a pile and I wanted to put out these songs that a lot of them I wish I could have put on Fearless, but
She has a very similar posture to Jared Leto.
It helped transform me.
re-release it and put these songs. I could not have wished for a more wonderful first touring experience. I've opened up for, it seems like every
Disengaging more again. Okay, I think we can see the Vultology is pretty clear. Now, as for her psychology, well, first the basics: singer-songwriter, dancer, performer. But on top of that, Taylor Swift is another one of those individuals that I'm not going to be able to do justice because there's just so much that goes into her. But just some of the basics here would be that she has sold over 200 million records worldwide, reached #1 in a lot of different places. There's no need to mention all of them. But here at the bottom, we can see that Swift has been recognized for her influential career and philanthropy, as well as advocacy of artists' rights. Now, artists' rights refers to artists' rights to own their own music, which is something we also saw with Prince. We'll talk about Prince later. But that's important because that's also part of autonomy and women's empowerment in the music industry. So I'm going to add these as categories. #1 music artist on Billboard, critically acclaimed, women of the 2010s decade, philanthropy, artists' rights to own their own music and creations, and empowerment of women in the music industry. So being the #1 music artist on Billboard correlates again with this obsession for being #1, and that has to do with perfectionism. So there's a connection between this and giving everything for the win and Jared Leto's dramatic transformation. Okay, and the last sample I have for us here is Yayoi Kusama. So she's 92 years old and still going, but bear in mind, because of her age, her Vultology may be slightly more inertial than would be for the baseline of JI lead. So we have to kind of do a little bit of a baseline adjustment. But even if you don't do that, you could still tell that she's a JI lead. But here, I'm going to show you guys what I mean. So first we have here the meticulous hands, disengaging eyes downward, disengaging again, slight moving of the eyes left and right. Notice that again, let's go back. This is kind of long. There. And the hands again. So she has these disengages, these freezes, and she just kind of like flatlines again, and then she picks back again. This is very characteristic of TI, the internal processing that neutralizes the emotional affect. And also we can see the tautness of her eye area. Despite the age and everything else, she still has that ocular attention. So Yayoi Kusama, artist, painter. So according to Wiki, Yayoi is a contemporary artist working in sculpture and installation. Yeah, I've been to one of her works. She has these enormous big structures, and she has been active in painting, in performance, fashion, poetry, fiction, and other arts. So let's add some of these in here. Contemporary artists, sculptures, large installations, some attributes of feminism, minimalism, surrealism, abstract expressionism infused with autobiographical, psychological, and sexual content. That is also true. She has some explicit material in her art, which for someone from Japan in the era she grew up in was very radical. And she has been recognized as one of the most important living artists to come out of Japan. All right, so to not have it inflate too much, I just limited it to these. So artist, painter, contemporary artist, sculptures, large installations, focus on feminism, focus on minimalism, surrealism, autobiographical / sexual content, and she's among most important Japanese artists. This last one has correlations again to Taylor Swift's being Woman of the 2010s decade, and as we saw before with the others. All right, and that concludes the TiSe samples. I think we got a pretty good handle on the Vultology of these guys. We saw how they are similar to the SETIs in the sense that there's a lot of kinesthetic focus, also painting. We saw a painter with James Jean, another painter with Yayoi Kusama, and we saw a focus on perfection, being #1, giving everything you got, doing everything pristine, and also having autonomy while doing it. So we have a very compelling set of data to suspect that there's something going on here between the Vultology that we're reading and the domains that these individuals choose to be in. And so that's what I want to bring your focus towards, that there's some reason, there's some objective reason why all these people are grouping together when we're looking at Vultology correlations, specifically the ones that we're outlining here with TI and SE. Anyway, that's it for the TiSe types, and we're going to move on now to the next video.